The fluorescent lights of the high-end wellness club hummed overhead, casting a sterile white glow across the polished chrome and marble of the locker room. It was a sanctuary of sorts for the women of Briarwood, a place to decompress after a punishing Pilates class or a vigorous swim. For the newer, younger members, it was also a stage, a place to see and be seen, to whisper and judge. Margaret Maggie Chen, a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and a lean, almost wiry frame, was decidedly not part of that scene. She moved with a quiet economy, her presence barely registering as she changed out of her swimsuit after an early morning lap session. She kept to herself, her face a calm, unreadable mask, which in the social ecosystem of Briarwood was often mistaken for meekness or social awkwardness. The self-appointed queen of this particular locker room was a woman named Kelsey. Kelsey was all long, highlighted hair, a perpetually pinched expression, and a voice that could carry across a tennis court. She ran with a pack of similarly styled women who had built their identities on exclusivity and casual cruelty. They had noticed Maggie before. She didn't fit. She wore practical, unflattering swimwear. She never lingered to gossip. She didn't acknowledge their unspoken authority. In their world, this was an affront that demanded correction. That Tuesday morning, the air crackled with a particular brand of entitled tension. Kelsey was recounting with dramatic indignation how Maggie had accidentally splashed her while getting out of the lap pool. It had been a genuine accident, a simple ripple of water, but Kelsey had inflated it into a deliberate act of disrespect. "I mean, who does she think she is?" Kelsey huffed, aggressively applying lip gloss.
"She acts like she doesn't even see us."
"Probably doesn't have the guts to look anyone in the eye," chimed in Brooke, her second in command, with a sneer. "Did you see her shoes? They look like she bought them at a surplus store." Fueled by the validation of her friends, Kelsey decided to act. As Maggie, now dressed in simple jeans and a plain t-shirt, moved towards the row of lockers to collect her bag, Kelsey stepped directly into her path. The other women in Kelsey's circle fanned out, creating a semicircle, a clear blockade. "Excuse me," Maggie said, her voice low and even. It wasn't a question or a plea, just a simple statement of fact. "No," Kelsey said, her smile tight and cold. "I don't think I will. We need to talk about pool etiquette." She poked a manicured finger into Maggie's shoulder, a sharp, deliberate jab. "You need to be more careful. Some of us pay a lot of money to enjoy our time here without being splashed by, well, by you." Brooke stepped closer, her arms crossed. "Yeah, maybe this isn't the right place for you. There's a public pool down the road. Might be more your speed." Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't step back. Her eyes, calm and dark, moved from Kelsey's face to Brooke's, then back again, taking in the entire scene with an unnerving stillness. To the young women, this silence was misinterpreted as submission. They thought they had cowed her. Kelsey, emboldened, gave Maggie another, harder shove. "Did you hear me?
"We don't want you here."
The shove was the trigger. It wasn't the physical contact that changed things, it was the intent. It was the threat. In that single instant, the locker room at the Briarwood Wellness Club vanished for Maggie. The hum of the lights became the distant thrum of a helicopter rotor. The scent of jasmine and sandalwood from the diffuser was replaced by the acrid smell of diesel and cordite. The marble floor beneath her feet felt like the packed dirt of a foreign land. For 20 years, Maggie Chen had been a United States Navy SEAL. She was one of the first women to ever complete the brutal, hellish training, and she had done so not as a publicity stunt, but as a quiet force of nature. She had operated in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, places that didn't appear on any map. She had been under fire, had returned fire, had saved lives, and, in the line of duty, had taken them. The women in front of her, with their fake nails and manufactured outrage, weren't a threat. They were a minor tactical problem. Her body reacted before her conscious mind could form the thought. As Kelsey's hand connected for the second time, Maggie's left hand came up in a motion so fluid and fast it was almost invisible. It didn't strike Kelsey, it simply deflected her arm, redirecting the force harmlessly to the side. At the same time, Maggie took a half step forward, closing the distance between them. Her center of gravity dropped slightly. Her posture didn't become aggressive, but it became immovable, rooted to the earth like an ancient oak. Kelsey's eyes widened in surprise. Her hand, which she had intended to use for another shove, was now trapped in a grip that felt like it was made of forged steel. Maggie wasn't even looking at the hand. Her gaze was locked onto Kelsey's eyes, and what Kelsey saw there made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was a profound, unsettling calm. It was the look of someone who had stared down death and found it manageable. "You need to step back," Maggie said, her voice still quiet, but now it carried a weight that filled the entire room. It was a command, not a request. It was the voice of authority, honed on countless fields of operation where a single word could mean the difference between life and death. Brooke, seeing her friend frozen, stepped forward to intervene, her hand raised. "Hey,
Let go of her!
Without even turning her head, Maggie's free hand shot out, her palm open, stopping Brooke's advance not with a push, but with a gesture that was pure, unadulterated warning. The look she gave Brooke was a fraction of a second long, but it conveyed a universe of information. "I see you. I have assessed you. You are not a factor. Do not make yourself one." Brooke stopped in her tracks, her mouth hanging open. The entire confrontation had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The other women in Kelsey's circle stood frozen, their carefully cultivated personas of toughness shattering around them. They were predators who had just realized they were attempting to intimidate an apex predator. Maggie released Kelsey's arm. The young woman stumbled back, cradling her wrist, her face pale, her perfectly applied lip gloss now a garish smear against her bloodless lips. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Maggie said, her voice dropping even lower, a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze a silent roll call. "You see someone quiet, someone who doesn't perform for your approval, and you mistake that for weakness. It's a common mistake, but it's a dangerous one." She turned back to her locker, calmly retrieved her worn canvas bag, and slung it over her shoulder. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the soft zip of her bag closing. As she walked towards the door, she paused beside a woman who had been watching from a bench, a middle-aged lady with kind eyes. Maggie gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that the performance was over, and then she was gone. The door swung shut behind her, leaving the stunned silence in her wake. Kelsey, Brooke, and the others stood exactly where they were, the reality of what had just happened slowly dawning on them. They hadn't been in a fight. They had been in the presence of something they couldn't understand, and it had dismantled their world with a few quiet words and a single controlled movement. They had tried to rough her up, and they had failed spectacularly, not because she had fought back, but because she had simply, effortlessly, revealed the vast, unbridgeable gulf between them. The story of the incident, however, did not stay in the locker room. The woman on the bench, a retired history teacher named Eleanor, had seen everything, and she knew a few people on the club's board. Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate. Who was that woman? The quiet one with the short hair? What happened in the locker room? The story that spread was a game of telephone, each retelling adding a layer of drama. Some said Maggie had thrown Kelsey against the lockers. Others claimed she had delivered a karate chop that would have broken Brooke's arm. The most outlandish version had her disarming an imaginary weapon. But the core truth remained. A quiet, unassuming woman had stood her ground against the club's resident bullies and had left them looking utterly foolish and terrified. Kelsey, humiliated and furious, tried to spin the narrative. She told anyone who would listen that Maggie was a crazy woman who had physically assaulted her. She demanded that the club revoke Maggie's membership. She expected the management to side with her, a long-standing, high-paying member. The club manager, a meticulous man named David, was in a difficult position. He had conflicting stories. Kelsey's was loud and full of demands. Maggie's, when he finally reached her by phone, was a calm, concise, and almost boring account of the facts. There was a misunderstanding. I was leaving and they blocked my path. I asked them to move. There was no physical altercation. The mystery only deepened until a club board member, a retired Air Force colonel named Harrison, heard the whispers. He'd seen Maggie in the pool before, noting her powerful, efficient stroke. He'd also noticed the faded tattoo on her forearm, a small, almost hidden trident, partially obscured by a sleeve. He recognized it. He made a few discreet calls to some old contacts. A week after the locker room incident, David called both Kelsey and Maggie in for a formal meeting to resolve the matter. Kelsey arrived with Brooke in tow for moral support, both of them dressed in expensive athleisure wear, their faces set in expressions of righteous indignation. Maggie arrived alone, dressed in her usual simple clothes, her expression placid. David began, his voice professional. "Thank you both for coming. We have a serious complaint to address. Ms. Vance has alleged that Ms. Chen physically assaulted her in the women's locker room." Kelsey jumped in immediately. "She grabbed my arm, hard, and she threatened us. It was terrifying. She's clearly unstable and she doesn't belong in a place like this." David held up a hand. "Ms. Vance, please. I'd like to hear from Ms. Chen." He turned to Maggie. Maggie looked at Kelsey, then back at David. "As I told you on the phone, I was leaving the locker room. Ms. Vance and her friends blocked my path. She placed her hand on my shoulder twice. The second time I deflected it. I did not grab her. I asked her to step back. That was the extent of it." "She's lying!" Kelsey shrieked. "She's a lunatic! You can't believe her!" Just then the door to the office opened and Colonel Harrison walked in. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 70s, with a ramrod-straight posture and eyes that missed nothing. David looked up, surprised. "Colonel, we're in a private meeting." "I know, David," Harrison said, his voice calm but firm. He looked directly at Maggie and a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "I apologize for the interruption, but I had to confirm something for myself." He extended his hand to Maggie. "Chief Petty Officer Chen, it's an honor." Maggie stood and shook his hand, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Colonel?" Kelsey and Brooke stared, utterly confused. "Chief Petty Officer?" Harrison turned to David and then to the two young women. "The term Chief Petty Officer is a senior non-commissioned officer rank in the United States Navy. But in this case, it's a title that represents something far more significant. I made some inquiries after I heard some interesting rumors. Margaret Chen served for 20 years. She is a graduate of BUD/S training. She is a Navy SEAL. And from what I can gather from my sources, she had a rather distinguished career." The word SEAL hung in the air like a thunderclap. Kelsey's mouth fell open. Brooke's face drained of all color. A Navy SEAL. The woman in the worn jeans and the surplus store shoes. The woman they had tried to intimidate. She was one of the most elite warriors on the planet. David looked from Harrison to Maggie, his jaw slack. Is this true, Ms. Chen?" Maggie gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "I served. It was a long time ago." Her humility in that moment was more powerful than any boast could have been. Harrison chuckled. "Typical. She'll probably tell you she was just a cook." He turned to Kelsey, and the humor vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard stare that would have made a young private quake. "The point is, young lady, the person you are accusing of assault is a decorated combat veteran. She has spent her life learning to handle situations far more dangerous than a disagreement in a locker room with a level of discipline you cannot possibly imagine. The fact that you are standing here, unharmed, able to make these baseless accusations, is a testament to her restraint, not her aggression." Kelsey looked at Maggie, truly looked at her for the first time. She saw the quiet strength in her posture, the calm in her eyes, the slight calluses on her hands. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The unflinching gaze, the quiet, commanding voice, the way she had moved, not with fear, but with the controlled, efficient grace of someone who had been trained to move through chaos. They hadn't tried to rough up a meek, middle-aged woman. They had tried to physically intimidate a person whose entire career was built on being the most dangerous person in any room. The shame was a physical weight, hot and heavy in her chest. David cleared his throat, the silence becoming unbearable. "Well, this certainly puts things in a different light. Ms. Vance, given these new facts, I think it's safe to say that your complaint is without merit. I would suggest that in the future, you and your friends be more mindful of how you treat other members of this club." Kelsey and Brooke couldn't get out of the office fast enough. They fled, their expensive sandals slapping against the floor, their carefully constructed world of social dominance in ruins. They had learned a brutal lesson about assumptions, and it was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The news of who Maggie really was spread through Briarwood like wildfire. But this time, the whispers were different. They were filled with awe and a collective sense of embarrassment. The quiet woman in the lap pool was a legend. The atmosphere around her shifted dramatically. People held doors for her with a new deference. They offered her nods of respect instead of dismissive glances. The pack of women who had once ruled the locker room now avoided it when she was around, scurrying past with their heads down. For Maggie, the change was initially uncomfortable. She hadn't sought validation then, and she didn't seek it now. She had simply wanted to swim in peace. But something unexpected happened in the weeks that followed. The story of the locker room encounter, stripped of its more outlandish rumors and grounded in the truth of her service, began to resonate with other women in the club. It started with a hesitant approach by a young woman named Sarah, who was often in the pool at the same time as Maggie. Sarah was training for a triathlon, and she was struggling. She'd seen Maggie's flawless, efficient stroke and was in awe. "Excuse me," Sarah said one morning, her voice timid. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I saw you swimming. Your form is incredible. I'm training for an Ironman, and my swim leg is my weakest. I was wondering if you might have any tips." Maggie looked at her for a long moment, then a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first time Sarah had seen her smile. "Sure," Maggie said. "The biggest mistake people make is fighting the water. You have to learn to work with it, to become part of it. It's like anything else. It's about efficiency, not just power." That small interaction was the catalyst. Soon, other women began to approach her. A middle-aged woman who had recently lost her husband and was struggling to find the motivation to exercise. A teenager who was being bullied at school and had lost her confidence. A new mom, overwhelmed and isolated, looking for a moment of peace and a friendly face. They didn't come to her because she was a SEAL. They came to her because of the quiet strength she exuded, the calm, non-judgmental presence she offered. Her legend had opened a door, and her character was what kept it open. They would find her in the quiet corner of the locker room or by the side of the pool, and they would talk. Maggie listened more than she spoke. When she did offer advice, it was simple, practical, and profound. She never talked about her missions or her medals. Instead, she talked about discipline, about perseverance, about the importance of showing up, even on the days you didn't want to. She talked about mental toughness, not as something you were born with, but as a muscle you built, one small, consistent effort at a time. "Being strong isn't about never being afraid," she told the bullied teenager one afternoon. "It's about being terrified and doing what you need to do anyway. Fear is a compass. It points you towards the things you need to confront to grow." To the overwhelmed new mom, she said, "The most important mission is the one right in front of you. Don't worry about the whole day or the whole week. Just get through the next hour, then do it again. You'd be surprised how far that will get you." She became an unofficial mentor, a quiet source of strength for a small, unofficial circle of women. They didn't form a club or have meetings. They just knew she was there, a stabilizing presence in the otherwise frivolous environment of the wellness club. The locker room, once a place of petty judgment and social anxiety for some, became a slightly safer, saner space because of her. Kelsey and her friends never approached her again. They had retreated to the margins, their reign effectively over. They had learned their lesson, but it was a lesson born of fear and humiliation. The other women who gathered around Maggie, however, were learning a different lesson. They were learning about quiet resilience, about true strength, and about the kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. One day, a few months after the incident, a woman named Diane, whose daughter Maggie had been informally coaching in the pool, approached her with a request. "Maggie, I know you probably hate this kind of thing, but the local high school swim team is having a really tough year. Their coach quit, and the girls are demoralized. They're a good group, but they just don't believe in themselves. I was wondering, would you ever consider just coming and talking to them? Not about being a SEAL necessarily, but just about what you talked about with my daughter, about perseverance." Maggie was silent for a long time, looking out over the calm blue water of the pool. The request felt different. It wasn't about her past in a way that glorified violence or war. It was about the principles that past had taught her. It was about passing something on. She thought of her own early days in training, the moments of bone-deep exhaustion and despair, the instructors screaming in her face, telling her she didn't belong. She thought of the quiet, stubborn voice inside her that had refused to quit, that had just focused on getting through the next hour. She thought of all the people, men and women, who had helped her along the way, who had modeled that same quiet resilience. She turned to Diane, and the small, genuine smile touched her lips again. "Okay," she said, "I can do that. Not about the Navy stuff, just about getting through the next hour." And so, Margaret Chen, the quiet woman in the surplus store shoes, the 20-year Navy SEAL veteran who had been mistaken for a target in a locker room, found a new mission. It wasn't on a battlefield in a foreign land. It was on the pool deck of a local high school, in front of a group of uncertain teenagers. She stood before them, not in uniform, but in her plain clothes, her presence commanding attention not through volume, but through a palpable sense of grounded authority. She didn't tell them about firefights or classified operations. She told them about Hell Week, about the cold, about the sleep deprivation, about the moment she wanted to ring the bell and quit more than anything in the world. She told them about the buddy who had looked at her, unable to speak, and just nodded, and how that nod had been enough to get her through the next hour. She talked about setting small, achievable goals, about focusing on your own lane, about the fact that the only person you're truly competing against is the person you were yesterday. The girls listened, spellbound. They saw in her not a warrior, but a coach, a mentor, a living example of the principles she was teaching. After she finished, they didn't swarm her with questions about guns or combat. They asked her about how to breathe better during a turn, how to push through the pain in the last 50 meters, how to not get psyched out by a faster opponent in the next lane. As she drove away from the school that day, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The locker room incident, which had started as an annoyance, had peeled back a layer of her anonymity. It had forced her story into the light. And now, that story was taking on a new life, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a source of quiet inspiration. They had tried to rough her up, and in doing so, they had inadvertently introduced the world to the gentle, powerful soul of a warrior, whose greatest battle now was simply helping others find their own strength, one small hour at a time. The legend of the locker room had faded, replaced by something far more meaningful. The legacy of a quiet leader, teaching the next generation how to stop fighting the water and finally, to become one with it.